We know him as Imam Al Nawawi, but his full name is Abu Zakaria Yahya ibn Sharaf al-Hizami al-Nawawi.
He was born in 631 Hijri. 631, that's roughly 800 years ago now. In the small town of Nawa, from which he gets his eponym, which is in Syria. In a short space of time, he's born in 631, passes away into the eternal rahmah of Allah Azza wa Jal in 676, 45 years. And in 45 years, he's left behind a legacy that's made his name a worldwide phenomenon. And he's Shafi'i in his fiqh. But the Hanafis and the Malikis and the Hanbalis acknowledge his scholarship and refer to him. He's Ash'ari in Aqidah. And yet the Atharis as well as the Maturidis also celebrate his works.
The 7th century Hijri was a very turbulent time in Muslim history. On one hand, from one end, you had the Crusaders that were waging conflicts on the Muslim lands. That Jerusalem was conquered for a large portion of Imam Al Nawawi's time, and in fact they reconquered Jerusalem in 1245. So he was a young boy when it was reconquered. And on the other hand, in the year 1258, this is a watershed moment in Muslim history when you have the Mongols coming from the east and invading and sacking Baghdad. And as we remember, or we should remember, that Baghdad was the center of learning in the entire world at that time. And as much as the conditions for the Muslims now are terrible, and we certainly pray for afiyah and comfort for Muslims all across the world, if you read the history and the accounts of what happened in Baghdad, it pales in comparison to anything that we see today, right? Because they say that the Tigris and the Euphrates, that one of the rivers was running red with the blood of people that were killed, and the other river was black with the ink of all the books that were tossed in the river, right? That this was a turbulent time. This was a very difficult time. And at the same time, and 2 years later, the year 1260, is the famous Battle of Ain Jalut, when the Mongols are defeated for the first time. Right? So at the same time, the Muslims establish rule in Mali, and they establish a kingdom or a state in Indonesia. So why is all of this important? Is that we see that in the heartland of the Muslim empire, there's conflict and turmoil. Right? But on the border, on the hinterlands, right, to the south and to the east, there's expansion and there's spreading of Islam. And it's a very ironic and a very fitting mirror of what's happening today in the Muslim world. Right? We see that the Muslim lands and the traditionally Muslim lands, that they're under attack both internally and externally. And we find that Islam is on the hinterlands, out in the west and out in the east, that it's spreading and it's expanding, and people are coming to Islam like never before. So what should be appreciated is that despite this turmoil, despite all of these conflicts that were going on, that scholarship within the Muslim lands not only thrived and not only persisted, but it thrived and flourished despite all that was going on. Now, Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah, he was born in the village of Nawa, which is in Syria near Damascus, and his town was not a very scholarly city. It was not known for having huge madrasas or all these famous scholars that lived there. But even from a very young age, Imam Al Nawawi was very attached to learning.
And it's related about him that he was remarkable even as a child, as somebody who had a great degree of seriousness to him, his personality.
So you'll notice the average 3, 4, 5-year-old, they love running around, they love playing with toys. Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah was not like that at all. In fact, as a young child, he was known to be as a child that would often contemplate and just think. So while the other boys are running around and playing, Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah would just be sitting there and watching and observing. And there's a very interesting incident that Al-Maraqashi, one of the historians from Nawa, narrates about Imam Al Nawawi. He says it was at this incident where Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah was at the age of 8 that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed a special love for him in my heart. What was this incident? That the other boys in the town, they were just running around and playing.
And the other children were playing, and they were chasing him and teasing him or taunting him, as children will do, to try to get him to join in their games. And he was sitting aside and running away from them, and then sitting aside and crying and weeping. And so this person asked, "Why don't you play with the children?" And he said, "Ma li hadha khuliqna." But it wasn't for this that we were created.
And you see from a very young age that, subhanAllah, Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah had a completely different outlook on life than the other children that were around him. From this event, Al-Maraqashi actually went to speak to Imam Al Nawawi's Quran teacher, who in turn went to speak to Imam Al Nawawi's father and told him, "Look, your son has, this special gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Make sure he's given that nurturing, that he deserves." So Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah, he finished his hifz of the Quran while he was in Nawa. So as a young boy, before the age of puberty, he finishes his Quran hifz.
There's a story that's mentioned at the age of 7, that one night of Ramadan, on the 27th night, that the family was sleeping, and they had a very small house. And Imam Al Nawawi woke up and he told the rest of the family to wake up, wake up, wake up. And it was pitch black dark in the house, and the father said to the son, he said, "What is it?" And he said, "Don't you see the entire house is illuminated?" And the father said that I knew that he had seen the light of Laylatul Qadr on that night. Right? And this is at the age of 7. And at the age of 10 or 12, the scholars of the time, when they saw him through their firasa is a lost science. It's where people can just look at someone's face and know everything there is to know about that person. Right? So they saw Imam Al Nawawi, and they knew that he would grow up to be a great person. So they counseled his father to support him and to encourage him to continue on this path. So eventually he finds his way to Damascus, where many of the great madrasas of his day were, and he begins to, after he had basically exhausted all of the potential knowledge that he could gain from Nawa, he's now in Damascus, and this is when his life of scholarship really takes off.
And you see that in these 45 years, he's written so many books. One of the books he wrote, Al-Majmu', he actually died before he finished it. And this book within of itself is thousands of pages long. Now the scholars, they took an approximation that if Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah started writing at the age of 18, till the day that he died, on average, how many pages did he write? He wrote an average of over 40 pages per day. In order for him to have achieved everything that he wrote, it would have been 40 pages a day from the age of 18 till the age that he died. That is how much he would have written per each day. So it shows you his great level of scholarship.
What made him so unique, this is to say a little bit about his qualities, that he had immense and tremendous piety. They say that he would fast every single day. They say, for example, that his wara'a, his scrupulousness, which one could say that he inherited from his father, was also in him. So he would never eat from any of the public gardens because he didn't know if there was some rights that were transgressed in the accumulation or in the acquiring of that food. So his father would have to send food from his village, and that would be the only food that Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah would eat. He was tremendously studious. He would go to 12 classes a day, which were an hour each, and he would review the notes from those classes from his shuyukh that he had studied for another hour. Right? So 12 hours of study plus 12 hours of review is 24 hours. Now, he was engaging in tremendous amounts of nawafil and tahajjud and all of the other things. And so one asks, how exactly was he able to do this? And the only answer we have is that you can't reproduce this in a laboratory. This isn't some scientific fact, but rather that he had tremendous barakah, tremendous blessing in his time.
This is so amazing. that I want you to think about, how you treat guests when you come over to your house. They'll come over to your house, you'll converse with them, you'll present them something to eat, and just show them a good time to entertain them. Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah, the way he would treat his guests, he would have a sahan, he would have a plate ready in the middle of his house. Then any time someone wanted to come, they were more than welcome. However, they would go through two things. Number one, Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah had so many books that there was no place to sit except for Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah himself. So if you wanted to sit down, you would have to lift some books and place them somewhere else. They didn't have bookshelves like we have today, so everything was just lying around on the floor. So that was the first difficulty. So you can imagine someone comes over to your house as I'm coming to visit, they get the clear message that you don't want them there when there's no place to sit. So they'll say what is important and then they'll leave, and that is it. Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah, his students mention that it was when the guests would come that Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah would then take the time to sharpen his pencils. That is the way he would keep himself busy. He didn't want anything to distract him from seeking knowledge. So when the guests would come, he would be speaking to them at the same time, and at the same time sharpening his pencils so that no time would be wasted whatsoever. No time would be wasted whatsoever.
And he himself said that he didn't sleep for 2 years lying down. That he would just be sitting and reading, and he'd fall asleep on his books, and then he'd wake up a few minutes or 30 minutes later or whatever it was, and he would just continue to do what he was doing.
Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah, he didn't get married. And he comments on this himself. He said, I fear that if I was to get married, I would fall into something haram. Meaning that I wouldn't be able to fulfill the rights of my wife. And the rights of the wife are great in Islam. They're very, very huge. That, the Prophet ﷺ, he emphasizes, very heavily, that the best of you are those that are best to your women folk, meaning the best to your wives. So he said he feared that he would fall into haram by not giving her due rights, because he loved knowledge so much, he loved teaching so much. And this is why that Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah, he didn't get married. So I want you to understand the political context of where Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah lived. That Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah, he lived at a time where a transition is taking place from the Ayyubid dynasty to the Mamluk dynasty. This has been the greatest fitna that struck the Muslim Ummah. The attack of the Mongols. That if you look at what they did with Baghdad, subhanAllah, in that time, they said that they killed over 500,000 of the Muslims. And they would just take their heads and they would just pile them up in the city. That you would see blood flowing in the streets of Baghdad, flowing into the rivers. And then who does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala choose to stand up and defend the Muslim civilization? It is a group of slaves. And that is where the title of Mamluks came from, that they were possessed. And the head of the Mamluks at that time, who stood up, was this individual by the name of Zahir al-Baybaris. So the ruler at that time, and he ends up becoming Khalifa, is Zahir al-Baybaris. Now unfortunately, subhanAllah, you would think that an individual that comes from a very humble beginning, not having any wealth, any property, he would appreciate wealth and be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yet unfortunately, this Muslim Ummah has been plagued with rulers and leaders that overindulge in this dunya, subhanAllah. So Zahir al-Baybaris, he defeats the Mongols, and this new Mamluk dynasty starts up. And then again, it becomes very oppressive, very, very oppressive. So now when this starts to happen, who is at the forefront of the opposition? It is Imam Al Nawawi. And Imam Al Nawawi, rahimahullah, this is a letter that is documented in history. He writes a letter to Zahir al-Baybaris. And he mentions that, oh Zahir al-Baybaris, you started as an individual that had nothing. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now made you the leader of the Muslim empire. Do not abuse your rights over the people. This awqaf, it doesn't belong to the ruler, but it belongs to the Muslim state, and that is the way it should remain. And then you see that Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah, he gets onto the forefront. And there's one other particular incident that you see from enjoining good and forbidding the evil, where Zahir al-Baybaris, again you see his greed for wealth, that this is one of the first times that a tax is levied upon the people without reason. So in Islamic history, the general concept of tax is that the Muslim ruler is not allowed to tax the civilians. You're not allowed to tax the civilians up and until there's a need for it. So for example, the Muslims are going to war and they need that wealth, then they can be taxed. Or there's a need of the community, then they can be taxed. But the general case scenario is that they are not to be taxed. So now when the war is completely over, everything is finished, their need for the money was finished. So Zahir al-Baybaris, instead of decreasing the tax on the people, he actually increases it on the people. And again, what does Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah do? Writes a very, very powerful letter. That fear the day where you will stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Where in this dunya you are taxing the people, and in the akhirah it is your deeds that will be taxed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another very powerful, staunch and harsh letter that he wrote to Zahir al-Baybaris. Now when this letter was written, he asked, who wrote this letter? And it was told to him that Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah wrote this letter. And then he became afraid, he didn't do anything. And you'll notice that even though Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah, he opposed Zahir al-Baybaris to such an extent that always opposing him, Zahir al-Baybaris never actually physically did anything to him. And it is said in the books of history that Zahir al-Baybaris was asked, why is it that you never imprisoned Imam Al Nawawi? Why is it that you never had him exiled? Why didn't you do anything? And he mentions over here that any time I would think of Imam Al Nawawi, I would find a fear inside of myself. A fear that I couldn't do anything to him. And the scholars commented that this is a sign of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said that whoever tries to harm one of my awliya, one of my close slaves, then I will wage war against this individual. And this is why Zahir al-Baybaris never actually harmed Imam Al Nawawi. This is why Zahir al-Baybaris never actually harmed Imam Al Nawawi.
Some of his famous works that bear mentioning is, number one, he has a very famous commentary on Sahih Muslim, which they say is second only to Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's rahimahullah's commentary on Sahih Bukhari. He wrote, the Bustan al-Arifin is another famous text. And then, of course, one of the most well-known texts, in addition to the Arba'in al-Nawawi, is the famous text Riyad al-Salihin, the Gardens of the Righteous, which is another collection of a hadith which primarily deal with targhib wa tarhib, about encouraging and admonishing people towards doing righteous actions and staying away from harmful actions. And of course, perhaps the most well-known of all of his texts is the Arba'in of An-Nawawi. As I mentioned, he dies at a relatively young age. He's only 45 years old when he passes away. And yet the works he left behind are tremendous. Tremendous amounts of work that he left behind. They say that when he passed away, that all he owned was a thobe, a staff, and a turban. Just these three items of clothing is all he had. And he didn't want to have any marker over his grave. He didn't want his grave to be celebrated. And yet, what ended up happening is that a tree grew from his grave. Right? That this is a sign that, and the tree, as we know, is a very powerful metaphor, which we don't have time to elaborate on, but it's a symbol of life, that even after he passes away, that's a tree which symbolizes life, grows from his grave nonetheless, despite him not wanting to have a marker.
Now, Al-Dhahabi rahimahullah, when he concludes the biography of Imam Al Nawawi, he mentions three important points. He says that Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah had three characteristics that he was at the pinnacle of, that he excelled at. And if any scholar of Islam just had one of these characteristics, he would be considered a great Imam within his own right. But Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah had become the pinnacle, had excelled at these three characteristics. Number one, his level of scholarship. That learning, reading, writing, and most importantly, disseminating. He was at the top of his game at that. Number two, his level of asceticism. That his lack of love for this dunya was unparalleled. Someone constantly worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Someone taking advantage of his time. Someone always doing some sort of dhikr. And then the third thing that he mentions is Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah enjoining good and forbidding evil. And subhanallah, these are the characteristics that all of the scholars are meant to have. These are like fundamental elements. And then it was Imam Al Nawawi rahimahullah that excelled at all three of them, was the pinnacle at all three of them, that made him the great Imam that he was. We pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mercy upon him and forgives us for his shortcomings and raises us with him in Jannatul Firdaus. Ameen.
أبدا لن نحيد أبدا لن نحيد أبدا لن نحيد عن خطى الإيمان دربنا درب قويم دربنا درب قويم بالهدى القرآني.